And now for a taste of things to come.
What is going on, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the second part of this special broadcast this evening. And yes, as the tagline says, let's talk horror movies. I am the Renegade J.J. Williams here on the Casa D18 Studios channel, welcoming you back for the second part of this special, this Halloween special, if you will. For those of you that may or may not have been here for the first part, we started in the silent era. We discussed things like the Edison version of Frankenstein, Nosferatu, Hunchback of Notre Dame, and Phantom of the Opera with Lon Chaney. Moved our way through the Universal Monsters, the Hammer films, Hitchcock's Psycho, and we kind of ended around 1968 with George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead, and with Rosemary's Baby from Roman Polanski. We're going to pick things up here in the 70s, and we're going to go through the end, the modern day horror movies. Yeah, if you don't want to hear me discuss it, just read the chats. Daniel's pretty much giving you a full-on history in the chat room, so if you don't want to hear me discuss it, just read his comments and go ahead and bounce. But if you would like to hear me discuss this, then hang out here with me. Love to have you. Go ahead and get the ticker going here. It's supposed to be a ticker. Let me just edit that real quick. But any super chats that are received today will be put towards BACA, B-A-C-A, that stands for Bikers Against Child Abuse. In the name of my cousin, Jamie, who lost her battle with cancer a couple weeks ago. We buried her this past Saturday. Today is the last opportunity to donate because Google AdSense and YouTube everything resets at the first of the month tomorrow. So anything donated today during this broadcast will be put towards that. Once again, I'm going to kind of go through, read my copy that I have typed up here, the research that I've done. And then once it's all done, I will answer any questions that you guys have today about horror movies. Super chatted questions will get the priority. And again, of course, the money raised off those super chats will go towards BACA, Bikers Against Child Abuse. But unlike normal streams, I will actually answer any and all questions today. Just super chatted ones will get the priority. So let's go ahead and let's pick things up here. As we enter the 1970s, the decade has often been described as a truly eclectic time for horror cinema, with some having a mixture of fresh and more personal efforts on film, while others were a resurrection of older characters that hadn't really appeared since the 30s and 40s. 1968's Night of the Living Dead had what was described as a slow burning influence on the horror films of the era. You see, some films just adapted the zombie framework, such as 1974's The Living Dead at Manchester Morgue, while others became what were described as, quote, the first of the genre auteurs. These included American directors such as John Carpenter, Tobe Hooper, Wes Craven, and Brian De Palma, as well as directors working outside of America such as Bob Clark, David Cronenberg, and Dario Argento. Now, prior to Night of the Living Dead, the monsters of horror films could easily be banished or defeated by the end of the film. While Romero's film and the films of other filmmakers would often suggest that other horror is still lingering after the credits. Horror films continued to be made around the world in the 70s. In the United Kingdom, Amicus Films focused their productions on humorous horror anthologies, such as Tales from the Crypt from 1972. Unfortunately, the studio stopped producing horror films by the mid-70s and closed completely in 1977. By the 1970s, Hammer Films pushed their films in different directions, such as their new series where vampires are implied to be lesbians in The Vampire Lovers and Lust for a Vampire, both of which were released in 1970, as well as Twins of Evil from 1971. Hammer's Dracula series was also updated to contemporary settings with Dracula AD 1972 and its sequel, The Satanic Rites of Dracula from 1972 and 73 respectively, after which Christopher Lee retired from the Dracula role. Hammer then ceased featured film production in the 70s. Other small booms in the Italian film industry included Argento's 1970 offering The Bird with the Crystal Plumage. Other smaller trends then permeated in Italy, such as films involving cannibals, zombies, and even Nazis. Some films of the 70s pushed the eroticism to the point of horror and pornographic film hybrids. The rise of zombie films towards the end of the decade was triggered by Romero's follow-up to Night of the Living Dead with 1978's Dawn of the Dead. Remakes also proved to be very popular choices for horror films in the 1970s, with films like 1978's Invasion of the Body Snatchers and Tales based on Dracula, which continued into the late 70s. Offerings like John Badham's Dracula and Werner Herzog's Nosferatu the Vampire, both of which were released in 1979. Other American productions also placed vampires in a contemporary setting, with Count Yorga Vampire from 1970 and the blaxploitation film Blackula in 1972. Blackula then set off a cycle combining the blaxploitation film and horror films with titles like Scream Blackula Scream, Blackenstein, and Ganja and Hess, all of which were released in 1973. European productions also continued to feature Dracula and Frankenstein, such as Paul Morrissey's Blood for Dracula in 1974 and Flesh for Frankenstein in 1973, which both delved into the eroticism of their stories. Although not an official remake, the last high-grossing horror film of the decade, 1979's Alien, took B-movie elements from films like 1958's It, The Terror from Beyond Space. However, 1973's The Exorcist was the film that has been described as getting Hollywood back into horror production. Along with Rosemary's Baby, it is described as having the grit and realism that was part of the new Hollywood movement of the period, with nuanced performances and non-star actors. Several films with the same religious motifs of The Exorcist followed in the 70s in America, with films like Abby in 1974 and 1976's The Omen, as well as Italy with films like A Black Ribbon for Deborah from 1974. In 1988, historians described the cycle as being burned out instantly, with films mostly borrowing from Rosemary's Baby and the last of the cycle to borrow from The Exorcist, being Amityville 2, The Possession from 1982. In 1963, Hitchcock defined a new genre with The Birds. This genre showed nature taking revenge on humanity, and it was expanded into a trend in the 70s. Following the success of 1971's Willard, a film about killer rats, 1972 had similar films with Stanley and an official sequel, Ben. Other films followed in suit, such as Night of the Lepus and Frogs, both of which were released in 1972, Bug from 1975, and 1976's Squirm. However, the turning point in the genre was the 1975 film Jaws, which became the highest grossing film at that point and moved the animal attacks genres towards a less fantastic route, with less giant animals and more real-life creatures, such as 1976's Grizzly, as well as Night Creature and Orca, both of which were from 1977, and then Jaws 2 in 1978. Jaws has been described as a concerto of shock, noting its memorable music theme and its monster not being a product of society like Norman Bates in Psycho, or family like 1974's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. These elements were then carried over into John Carpenter's 1978 classic, Halloween. Alien, Jaws, and Halloween were high-grossing hits based on relentless suspense machines with high visual sophistication. Along with the other mainstream forgive me a second, everybody. I got a little tongue-tied. I need to go back in my copy here so I don't miss anything. Along with the other mainstream hit film, Brian De Palma's 1976 adaptation of the Stephen King novel, Carrie. Halloween began the trend of teenagers becoming ever-present lead characters in horror films, while Carrie itself was a film described as having a dream logic due to its supernatural plot, which was extended to the plot of Argento's films like Suspiria in 1977 and Inferno in 1980. The 1980s marked the first time since the early 60s of horror film fandom when a far more loosely organized community of fans arose, thanks in large to the increased publication of fanzines and magazines such as Cinefantastique, Fangoria, and Starburst, while horror film festivals like Shock Around the Clock and Dead by Dawn began to develop. With the appearance of home video, horror films actually came under attack in the United Kingdom as video nasties, which led to people having their collections being seized by police, and some people being jailed for selling or owning certain horror films. The response to the video nasty issue led to horror films becoming dumber than the previous decade. And although films were not less gory, they were more lightweight, becoming more disposable, less personal works. As a result, directors who created the original material in the 70s, such as John Carpenter, David Cronenberg, and Tobe Hooper, would all, at least briefly, play it safe with Stephen King adaptations or remakes of 1950s horror material. In Italy, the Italian film industry would gradually move towards making films for television, The decade started with a high-budgeted production of Argento's Inferno in 1980 and with the death of Mario Bava. Lucio Fulci became what historian Roberto Curti called Italy's most prominent horror film director during the early 1980s. Several zombie films were made in the country in the early 80s from Fulci and others, while Argento would continue directing and producing films for others, such as Lamberto Bava, the son of Mario Bava. As Fulci's health began to deteriorate towards the end of the decade, many directors turned to making horror films for either Joe D'Amato's Filmerage Company, independent films, or works for television and home video. During the 1980s, the older horror characters like Dracula and Frankenstein's monster rarely appeared in film outside of nostalgic films like 1987's The Monster Squad or Waxwork from 1988. However, vampire-themed films continued, often in the tradition of authors like Anne Rice, where vampirism becomes a lifestyle choice rather than a plague or a curse. This was reflected in films such as 1983's The Hunger, as well as The Lost Boys and Near Dark, both of which were released in 1986. The 1980s also highlighted several films about body transformation and men becoming wolves. Special effects and makeup artists like Rob Bottin and Rick Baker allowed for more detailed and graphic transformation scenes for creatures such as werewolves in films like the 1981 films An American Werewolf in London and The Howling, while films like 1980's Altered States, 1982's The Thing, 1983's Videodrome, and The Fly from 1986 would all show the human body in various forms of transformation. Several other sequels took to the revival of 3D film in the 80s, following the surprise hit film Comin' At Ya in 1981. These included Parasite and Friday the 13th Part 3 in 1982, and Jaws 3D in 1983. Now, replacing Frankenstein's monster and Dracula were new, popular creatures and characters with more generic names, like Friday the 13th's Jason Voorhees, Halloween's Michael Myers, and Freddy Krueger from A Nightmare on Elm Street. Unlike the characters of the past, who were vampires or were created by mad scientists, these characters were seemingly people with common-sounding names who helped to define the slasher film genre of the era. Following the financial success of the original Friday the 13th in 1980, at least 20 other slasher films appeared in 1980 alone. These films usually revolved around 5 properties: unique social settings like campgrounds, schools, or holidays, and a crime from the past that was committed, like an accidental drowning, infidelity, or a scorned lover. Add a group of ready-made victims, such as camp counselors, students, or wedding parties, you're all set for a slasher film. Other more traditional styles continued into the 80s as well, such as supernatural-themed films involving haunted houses, ghosts, and demonic possessions. Among the most popular films of the style included Stanley Kubrick's film The Shining from 1980, Hooper's high-grossing Poltergeist from 1982, and the films of the Amityville horror film franchise. After the release of films based on Stephen King's books like The Shining and Carrie were successful, this led to further film adaptations of his novels, such as Cujo, Christine, and The Dead Zone, all of which were released in 1983, and Firestarter and Children of the Corn, both of which were released in 1984. Stephen King would even direct his own film with Maximum Overdrive in 1986. Horror films of the 1990s failed to develop as many new directors of the genre as it had in the 60s and the 70s. You see, young independent filmmakers such as Kevin Smith, Richard Linklater, Michael Moore, and Quentin Tarantino all broke into cinema outside of the genre at non-genre festivals like the Sundance Film Festival. The early 1990s really was not a good time for horror, bringing us excessive sequels such as 1990's The Exorcist III, Amityville 1992, It's About Time, and sequels to The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Friday the 13th, and A Nightmare on Elm Street. If you really think about it, in the 1990s, after the end of the Cold War, the United States didn't really have a serious enemy internationally. So this led to horror films adopting fictional enemies, predominantly within America. Things like the American government, large businesses, organized religion, and the upper class, as well as the supernatural and the occult. Items such as vampires or Satanists filling in as the horror villains of the 1990s. The 1990s, more than any decade before it, blurred genres and transcended existing ones. This led to postmodern horror films such as Wes Craven's New Nightmare in 1994, which examined horror films in an American society. In the Mouth of the Madness from 1995, which turns reality into a horror film, and Scream in 1996, which made several references to the horror films of the past. The release of Scream, scripted by Kevin Williamson, led to another brief revival of the slasher films, including the Williamson scripted I Know What You Did Last Summer in 1997. Other styles of teen-oriented horror that were popular in the 90s, but with less visibility than the post-Scream films, were films about supernatural youth, such as 1990's Mirror Mirror and Shrunken Heads from 1994, with the most popular of these films being 1996's The Craft. Cultural conflicts of the 1990s began to become the backdrop for several horror films of the era, ranging from issues involving abortion, which is seen in films like 1991's The Unborn, and even Alien 3 in 1992. Political correctness, like Body Snatchers from 1993, to affirmative action, welfare, and race-related issues, which are seen in The People Under the Stairs from 1991, as well as 1995's Tales from the Hood and Village of the Damned, also from 1995. The rise of other television shows such as Inside Edition, America's Most Wanted, and The Jerry Springer Show, Geraldo and Donahue. Horror films often featured anchor women and TV tabloid hosts as protagonists or supporting characters in films like 1993's Man's Best Friend, Scream in 1996, and The Night Flyer from 1997. The rapid growth of technology in the 90s, with the internet and the fears of Y2K causing the end of the world, were reflected in the plots of films like 1992's The Lawnmower Man, Brain Scan from 1994, and End of Days in 1999. Following the release of Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1992, a small wave of high-budgeted Gothic horror romance films were released in the 1990s. These included Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and Wolf, all of which were released in 1994, and Mary Riley in 1996. By the end of the 90s, 3 films were released that were described as cultural phenomenons. These included Hideo Nakata's 1998 film Ring, along with the South Korean film Whispering Corridors in 1998, led to sequels and similar ghost stories from Asian countries. The film only crossed over into the Western world after the 1990s. The second major hit was 1999's The Sixth Sense, another ghost story which has now been described as making an instant cliche of twist endings. And the final hit was the low-budget independent film The Blair Witch Project, also from 1999. Now, the first trend of horror films in the 2000s, the ones that followed the success of The Blair Witch Project, were described as being that of the parody format. Films like The Bogus Witch Project, The Blair Underwood Project, and the pornographic film The Erotic Witch Project, all of which came out in the year 2000. Other films included similar low-budget imitators, like The St. Francisville Experiment, also from 2000, with a similar plot to The Blair Witch Project. Alexandra Heller-Nicholas noted that the popularity of sites like YouTube in 2006 sparked a taste for amateur media, leading to the production of further films in the found footage horror genre later in the decade, with Wreck and Diary of the Dead, both from 2007, and Cloverfield in 2008, as well as the particularly financially successful Paranormal Activity from 2007. Following Paranormal Activity, the style was not known for the footage's possible authenticity, as it was with Blair Witch, but it was more of a specific film style. Postmodern horror films continued into the 2000s, as well, with Cherry Falls and Psycho Beach Party, both from the year 2000, but then it soon drifted into purely comedy and parody territory with 2000's Shriek If You Know What I Did Last Friday the 13th, and the Scary Movie film series, which also began in the year 2000. Other teen-oriented series began in the era with Final Destination, while the success of the 1999 remake of William Castle's House on Haunted Hill led to a series of remakes during the early 2000s. Movies like 2001's 13 Ghosts and 2003's Willard, Dawn of the Dead from 2004, The Fog from 2005, Prom Night in 2008, and The Last House on the Left in 2009. Several film series that were long left dormant were even resurrected in the 2000s, with titles like Jason X in 2001, Beyond Reanimator in 2003, Exorcist: The Beginning in 2004, and Land of the Dead in 2005. The popularity and innovative approach to zombies that was seen in 2002's 28 Days Later, as well as Shaun of the Dead and Dawn of the Dead, both from 2004, led to a revival of zombie films in the 2000s. We ended up getting 2007's I Am Legend, Pontypool from 2008, and 2009's Zombieland and Dead Snow. Several films came from Hong Kong, South Korea, Thailand, and Japan in the wake of the success of 1998's Ring. These films predominantly involved female detectives using various forms of investigation to solve mysteries about malevolent female ghosts. These films included The Eye and Dark Water, both from 2002, as well as 2003's Into the Mirror. This trend was echoed in the West with films like Fear.com and They, both from 2002, and Gothica, which starred Halle Berry in 2003. Hollywood also began remaking these Japanese films with The Ring in 2002, Dark Water in 2005. Outside of the Japanese ghost stories, Asian film industries also began developing what can only be described as bizarre horror films, with Uzumaki in 2000, Stacy in 2001, and several films by Takashi Miike. It was declared that there was to be a modest revival of British horror films in the 2000s, with the small trend of war films related to horror, with titles like 2001's The Bunker and Dog Soldiers in 2002, as well as the Hollywood-produced Below, which is also from 2002. Outside of several independent films and films attempting a style of horror that Dimension Films was making in the 90s, the breakouts of this new British horror were My Little Eye and 28 Days Later, both from 2002, Shaun of the Dead in 2004, and 2005's The Descent. David Edelstein of the New York Times coined a term for a genre that he described as torture porn in a 2006 article, as a label for films described, often retroactively, to over 40 films since 2003. Edelstein lumped in films such as 2004's Saw, 2005's The Devil's Rejects, and Wolf Creek from 2005. Under this banner, it suggests to the audience a titillating and shocking push for audiences to the margins of depravity in order to feel something. The label was described as intense bodily acts and visible bodily representations in order to produce uneasy reactions. Using the Saw film series as an example, it suggested that these films reflected a post-9/11 attitude towards increasing pessimism, specifically of no redemption, no hope, no expectations that we're going to be okay. A post-9/11 trend of stories that tend to rework or redo a reality that was too difficult to handle, similar to films like The Sixth Sense or The Matrix, also began to pop up. Horror films that seemed to follow this trend included ghost stories with films like 2001's The Others and The Orphanage from 2007. After the film studio Blumhouse had success with Paranormal Activity in 2007, the studio continued to produce films that grew to become hits in the 2010s, with the film series Insidious. This led to what has been described as the company's policy on, quote, commercial savvy with thematic risk that is often paid out, with films including 2017's Get Out, The Invisible Man in 2020, Happy Death Day from 2017, and film series like The Purge. Laura Bradley, in her article for Vanity Fair, noted that both large and small film studios began noticing Blumhouse's success, including A24, who did not specialize in horror or genre films. However, with the release of 2015's The Witch, 2018's Hereditary, 2019's Midsommar, A24's name grew more popular. These films were classified as elevated horror. However, horror aficionados and some critics pushed back against the notion that these films were doing something entirely new, noting that their roots lie in films like Night of the Living Dead and Rosemary's Baby. Excuse me. In the early 2010s, there came a wave of horror films that showed what was described as having psychedelic tendency that was inspired by experimentation of 1970s films and its subgenres, specifically folk horror. The trend began with two films in particular, 2009's Enter the Void and Beyond the Black Rainbow from 2010. Since these films, a series of films that are described as being a calamitous trip or creepy dreams were released, such as Burbian Sound Studio in 2011, Under the Skin in 2013, We Are the Flesh in 2016, and Climax in 2018. These films do not always share the consciousness expanding spirit of the 1960s and 70s, and it's believed that the reasons for these trends tended to be from filmmakers who grew up in the 70s, as well as home video distributors such as Arrow Video, Shameless, and Nucleus Films, releasing restorations of the more outlandish and forgotten films of the original psychedelic era. The expansion of international streaming media services is also thought to have boosted the popularity of horror as well. Several television series of horror on Netflix, such as The Haunting of Hill House, became successes for the platform. Blumhouse partnered with Amazon Prime in order to distribute, and then you also had Shudder, a streaming service dedicated primarily for horror titles. That was launched in 2015 and grew in popularity in subsequent years. I've actually got quite a few Shudder original titles in my DVD and Blu-ray collection. Streaming was cited as bringing increased international attention to Southeast Asian horror films in particular, particularly those from Indonesia, such as Joko Anwar's Satan's Slaves and Impedagore, and Roe from Malaysia. Adapted from the Stephen King novel, the 2017 version of It set a box office record for horror films by grossing $123+ million on opening weekend in the United States and nearly $185 million globally. The success of It led to further Stephen King novels being adapted, including It Chapter 2 and Pet Sematary and Dr. Sleep, all of which were released in 2019. Following the turn of the millennium rise of Asian horror films, South Korean horror films resurrected itself with zombie films, including Train to Busan in 2016, The Odd Family, Zombie on Sale in 2019, and 2020's Peninsula, as well as non-zombie related films such as The Wailing in 2016. However, the COVID-19 pandemic that began in 2020 disrupted the film industry, leading to several horror films having their releases postponed. Movies such as 2020's A Quiet Place Part 2 and 2021's Candyman, while other films like 2021's Censor had their production completely halted. During lockdowns, streaming for films featuring fictional apocalypses increased. Found footage horror found itself imposed into films set on desktops in Zoom meetings, with titles like 2020's Host, a film that was completely shot and set during the quarantine period. This helped to further enhance the "this really happened" aspect of the genre. Films based on more internet culture followed in the years to come, with films like Dashcam and We're All Going to the World's Fair, both from 2021, as well as Deadstream and Bodies, 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 both from 2022. It seemed that one of the grander overarching themes of the 21st century horror films was about collapse, with horrific effects, imagery, and sounds overwhelming conventional storytelling in favor of the logic of the nightmare. Blumhouse furthered its relationship with Universal Pictures by scheduling similarly budgeted films like The Invisible Man in 2020, following the halted launch of their Dark Universe series, with the release of The Mummy from 2017, which starred Tom Cruise. Further franchise installments and reiterations of old stories were continued as films involving Dracula, exorcisms, and entries in series such as Evil Dead, Insidious, Scream, and Saw were also released. In modern-day horror, the latest trend seems to be the adaptation of public domain properties into the horror genre. While definitely not the first, this trend seemingly gained momentum in 2023 when A. Milne's Winnie the Pooh entered the public domain, allowing Rise Frake Waterfield to write and direct Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey. Making $7.7 million off of a $100,000 budget proved that it was successful enough in order to produce a sequel. Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey 2 did about the same, earning $7.6 million off of a $500,000 budget. These successes have allowed for what is being called the Twisted Childhood Universe to be produced, in the vein of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, with characters such as Bambi, Peter Pan, Tinkerbell, Hook, Pinocchio, and Jiminy Cricket playing a part in the universe, along with the already established Winnie the Pooh characters. Along with the Twisted Childhood universe, there has also been a film recently released entitled The Mousetrap, which was released earlier this year, thanks to the fact that the Mickey Mouse cartoon Steamboat Willie has now entered the public domain. And that wraps up the second part, everybody. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let's go ahead and see what Daniel has said here, because again, he's the only one that's been commenting along. It says we went through the origins and Universal monsters, now to the 70s where horror decline and rise. He said that he was especially scared the iconic movie icons of the 80s, but now I love their work, people like Robert Englund. He says, thankfully, I wasn't scared of other icons like Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, Chucky, Pinhead, and who can forget Ghostface. Thanks to them, we have new horror icons like the Creeper from Jeepers Creepers and characters like Jigsaw and now Art the Clown. Let's see what else here. But yeah, that about covers it. I want to thank everybody that joined me here today for this special broadcast. Greatly appreciate each and every one of you. Be safe this Halloween. Whatever you get into, whatever you've got planned, be careful. Don't be an idiot. Keep your eyes peeled if you're out for children. You know, I know it's traditionally said that if you're out at night, wear light-colored clothes. That way you can be seen better, but it's Halloween. Not every costume is going to be a light-colored outfit. Make the kids your priority over yourself. Make sure that you have your lights on. You're not driving without headlights. Make sure you adhere to all the rules of the road. We don't need to wake up in the morning and hear about kids dying because some idiot in a car hit them while they were out trick-or-treating. So please be careful out there. Have fun. Be safe. Thank you, Pop. I was hoping you would be there. I was hoping you'd pop in here at some point. But yeah, thank you all for joining me and tuning in today. And until tomorrow, when we do Simply Predicting for Crown Jewel, I am the Renegade J.J. Williams, thanking y'all for tuning in. I will catch you guys next time.